thinking about epistles then, is it right that we tend to think of epistles as being beginner material for preaching? If you take a preaching class, you start with an epistle, or not? Maybe not. I think the reason that people start, some do, not everybody, but people start with epistles because you don't have to think too hard about the application. It's written to a church. We're preaching to a church. You know, it's not before Jesus, it's after Jesus. So in that sense, it's straightforward. But once you get into them, you realize how complex. You're dealing with an argument that is very developed, and it's squeezed into a section. And actually, it can be very difficult to drop into an epistle and to preach a passage effectively, exactly like you say, because it's so there compared to a narrative. Does anyone else find that a narrative, a gospel, or even an Old Testament story? That, in a sense, the work is sort of done for you in a different way with a narrative. Well, not a problem, but the positive about Genesis or John or a narrative is that it's something you can see. As you read it, you can imagine it. You know, I think about the screen. I talk about having a screen, you know, like this, in the heart of the listeners, and when you start preaching, it's like this. You can't see anything. It's sort of smoky. But if you do a good job describing the action and telling the story, the smoke clears and the picture starts to form. And after a while, it's like they're watching the movie, and they're having the same reactions that they would have if it was a movie. Either I like this person, or I don't like this person, or I hope this works out, or I hope this person gets justice. You know what I mean? You relate to people, don't you, rather than to ideas. And epistles often are presenting ideas and truths and arguments. And it's hard to see that. It's hard to visualize what that means. You know, so I think that's one of the challenges that we have with the epistles. Although, like you say, the applications are easier in one sense. We're in effect getting one part, or a glimpse into a story. It's like a photograph of one moment in a bigger story. And that's the thing that I want us to enter into in this session, is to realize that if we're not careful, we can treat an epistle as a document of truths, like a treasury of truths that we open, pull out a truth and preach it. But that is always going to be very weak compared to actually making sense of that as part of the story that it is in. Okay, so every epistle is part of a story. There's a story going on. It's the story of the author and the church or the people that he's writing to. That there's a history around it. I did my master's thesis on Romans, looking at a certain section of the book of Romans. And as I was dealing with the background to Romans, I came to the idea, I think it was first suggested by Philip Melanchthon back in the 1500s, that Romans is a theological treatise, that it's just an abstract set of truths that is not rooted in any specific situation. And as I traced that through, I concluded it's absolutely not that. Romans is Paul writing the gospel to a specific church at a specific time with specific issues, and therefore everything he says is deliberately targeted to them. And the problem is, if you don't see that, and you think, okay, Romans, that is the gospel in the vacuum, just separate from reality, well then why is it that Romans doesn't emphasize some things that other books will? Why does Romans make so much of some things but not much of other things? Is it because those other things are not important? Or is it because they're not important in that situation for Paul to talk about? And so on the notes there, I've got this quote from Peter Stuhlmacher in this book about the whole Romans situation. And whatever we think of his theology beyond that, I love this statement. He says, Paul nowhere expounds abstract theology, but always only concrete exhortation. I'm convinced that is true. Paul never just gives a theological textbook in a letter. He always targets the people he knows that he's communicating with. That's why 1 Thessalonians is different than Ephesians, is different than 2 Corinthians, is different than Titus. and yet the theology is consistent across the whole of Paul, the whole Bible, because it's taking the gospel and applying it to a specific situation. And if we take literature that is a specific application of the gospel to a situation, and we just preach it as general truth, we're missing something. Whereas if we can preach the specific situation and then show how our situation is connected, then suddenly people will care about what he says. It's sort of like this idea. I remember hearing one of the teachers that I had speaking about illustrations. And so follow me here, so there's a disconnect. But he was talking about illustrations, and he said, what we usually do is we think, I will make my description, my illustration, general. Because if it's general, I just put it up here, then each person can grab it and they can translate it into their situation. And so, for example, this is not a great illustration, but he said, let's say you're describing driving down the road and somebody pulls in front of you. If you give that, people don't grab it and say, oh, I know what that means. They just let it pass by. It's just an idea. He said, if you take a little bit longer and you describe what it's like to be driving down the road from Krakow to past Auschwitz, and you give a specific, and you describe the feeling when the white BMW cuts in front of you. He said, by giving specifics, it doesn't mean that people say, oh, I've never been there. What they do is they translate the specific to their own experience. And so in their mind, for me, I wouldn't be thinking of Auschwitz with cars. I'd be thinking of England. But if I hear a description of a white BMW cutting in front of a car in Poland, I can immediately feel what that's like in my experience. And so we don't translate from up here, we translate from down here. And so if I say something that is specifically relevant to Hugh, then the people around him will just translate it to themselves. Now, that's true with illustrations. I think the same thing is true with epistles. If we just preach epistles as general truth, I think we're being unrealistic to expect people to say, now, in our situation, this is what that means. No, what they do is they see this truth floating in the air, they wait till you finish, and then they shake your hand and say, thank you, great word. But it's not touched them, it's just, you've just done preaching, you've done church. But if you can describe the situation in Rome as you're preaching Romans, so that they say, oh, that's a bit like us, because in the Roman church there's this division between Jewish and Gentile Christian. That's a bit like here where we have the Slovaks and the Czechs or whatever, the division, see, off already, between the two peoples, and recognizing how Paul's working his way through, all the way through Romans, so that when he gets to chapter 15, verse 7, therefore welcome one another, accept one another. Yes, that's what the whole message has been going towards. Do you see what I mean? So if we just preach truth, people will thank us for the truth, but it won't change lives. If we can describe a specific, if we can get into the reality of that epistle, then they can transfer it and we can help them. Our situation is a little bit like that, isn't it? You think of Corinth, for example. You talk about the church at Corinth and how geographically it was on a land bridge between Achaia and Greece, and there was also this sea bridge where they would bring the boats and bring the materials across and then put them back in the boat to carry on instead of sailing around the bottom. And so you've got sailors and you've got lorry drivers, right? They're all coming through Corinth. And what do you have in Corinth? Well, you have the temple to Aphrodite, among other things. And so you've got a lot of prostitution, and you've got sailors, and you've got lorry drivers, and you've got a church that's influenced by the Greek philosophical entertainment industry, and you describe that, and then you can then apply Corinthians to that church, but at the same time, how difficult is it to see the relevance to us? We live, most of us, in places where people come through. It's not just one town in the south of France that has sailors coming through with all of the sin that goes with that. Every town, every country has some sense of that. We're in a culture where there's an overload of people moving through and the ideas of what's appropriate and what's good entertainment and what's sophisticated and what's not. Actually, Corinth is not too distant from Europe today. You see what I mean? Okay, so we want to think about that in terms of Ephesians, because Ephesians has some of those same dynamics, but it also has a uniqueness to it that we have to address as well. So let's look at it here. I've put here one side of a telephone conversation. Have you ever had that experience of listening to one side and trying to figure out the other side? I used to do this all the time with my mother on the phone. Okay, so every evening I'd be watching television or something and the phone would ring and my mum would go and talk. And my sister and I would listen to her and we would first of all try to figure out who's she talking to, and secondly, what's going on. And so from her tone of voice we could usually tell, is it Dad? Is it, sometimes he's in Italy and we were in England, is it Dad? Is it her sister? Is it her other sister? Is it her friend from church? Is it the other friend from church? And from the tone of voice, we're going, I think it's Julie. Julie. And then we'd listen to a little bit, we'd get some information. I think they're talking about their other sister, Wendy. And we'd work out from one side what was happening. And sometimes we were right, sometimes we were wrong. But that's kind of what we do with epistles, isn't it? When you're reading the answer to a question and you don't have the question, what would they have asked? Or what's going on that makes Paul say that? Why is it just use Corinthians for an example. We'll focus in on Ephesians in a minute. But in Corinthians, why is it in chapter 6, Paul's talking about being united with a prostitute, and yet in chapter 7, you've got people that are refusing to be married properly, physically? What's going on there? Well, he's shifting to answering questions he's been asked instead of just responding to reports he's heard. Okay, so even though they're right next to each other, there is a difference. How could the same church have those two problems? Well, then you get back into the background and into the dualism and the sort of the early Gnostic thoughts of, it's not so much Gnosticism, but the dualism that spirit is good and material matter is bad. And so you have within the same church some people who are saying the matter, the physical doesn't matter, I can do what I like, so I'm going to go and indulge with a prostitute. And at the same time, you've got people saying, well, this doesn't matter, so I'm going to stop it from existing, so I could be spiritual. So I'm married, but I'm not going to enjoy my marriage, and my wife can just suffer as well because I'm being spiritual. Same problem, two different manifestations. So again, it's the background that makes sense of what Paul's writing. But he never says that. He just addresses one, then he says, now concerning, and moves on to the other one. And so that we're going to do a lot of that as we are reading the Bible, trying to understand what's going on behind, and we've got to be humble about that. Anytime that we become overconfident in our interpretation of the background, that's risky, isn't it? You can construct this whole idea that makes no sense in reality. One example, and I think all of us may fall into this, we can very easily read things as individual. When Paul says you, we read it as you, because we're in individual cultures. Certainly the further west you go, the more individualistic. Okay, so we can read that as an Australian or an English person or an American, probably more than some of the others, but we can all do that, and we read it and we say, no, this is a specific situation for individuals, when actually the writer of the epistle is writing to you as a group. And so maybe in some of your languages you have a difference between you singular and you plural. That's helpful. Thank God for your language if you have that, because in English, we just don't see that at all. But that's going to make a huge difference, isn't it? Think of just working through Hebrews last week in our training program back at home. Hebrews 6. If you read Hebrews 6 from an individual perspective, you'll end up with a very different theology than if you understand it as a corporate group, some of which are drifting away from something they've been exposed to. If it's an individual, then you have a different view of salvation. So it's something to be wary of and be careful of. So how do we get historical background? Where do we find the information that will help us to understand what is going on behind the scenes? Any thoughts? Where do you go to get that kind of information? Okay, so within the letter, Acts, other places within the Bible, historical books, yeah, archaeology, resources, references, Google. Yeah. Wikipedia. And it's not a wrong thing to do, to use Wikipedia or Google, just as long as you know that anybody could have put it there. Just because it's there doesn't mean it's anything good, but it's not sanctified. That's right. And so maybe it's just because of the order of things on the page, but I think it is important to start with the Bible. A lot of people do it the other way around, and they start with the reference materials, especially if you have access to a library. You know, go and look up in a dictionary or in an encyclopedia, Ephesus. Ah, look, all this information is so helpful. It may be helpful, but it also may be information covering several centuries. You know, and so if you're reading in historical encyclopedia about the city of Ephesus and you discover it's a port town, and you don't keep reading, you don't discover that actually it wasn't always a port town. It eventually stopped being one because the river became land. And so Ephesus became landlocked. By the time of the Bible, it's not the port that it was 200 years before the time that we read this letter. And so you see that the history documents cover a lot of information. We're jumping in at one point in time. And because of that, and for other reasons, I think we should start with the biblical reality. What do we have biblically that will help us to understand this? Bearing in mind that archaeology and historical materials and reference tools, none of those are inspired. Right? And all of those could be superseded. You know, you can read, for example, if you go back 100 years, you'll read information in the expert documents, you know, the expert encyclopedias, that today will not be in the encyclopedias because it's been proven wrong. So, for example, Pontius Pilate. There's no historical record of Pontius Pilate. He's clearly been made up by the gospel writers. This is fiction. And for a long time, that was a big critique of the Bible. Wouldn't you think that somebody as important as the governor of Judea would be in history? And Christians were like, well, we believe it, you know, and that critique was going on until some archaeologist digs up a stone in Caesarea Maritima, dusts it off, and Pontius Pilatum, you know, Eudorium, it's all on there, and suddenly you have to republish the encyclopedias. Pontius Pilate, who is a figure of history, and you know, and by now the historical information about Pilate is incredible. The amount of stuff that we know now, 60 years ago we didn't know it. And so we have to be humble, right? That means that what we know today in our history books, in our encyclopedias, could still be wrong. And so it doesn't matter if you've got the 2013 edition, the 2053 edition may be quite different. More archaeology, more study, more history, yeah. And so I would say use that material. Appreciate it. We've got access to more now than we've ever had before. You will speak English, so you have access to it in your own language plus the English language, which does have one or two more books than some other languages, right? Be thankful for that. But we've got to start with and focus on the Bible. The Bible is something that isn't changing, it isn't shifting, and so that's going to be the best source of information for understanding what's going on. So I put on there internal within Ephesians. What are some of the clues within the book of Ephesians that might help us to understand what's going on in the background? What are some of the elements of the letter that you think, that's one side of a conversation? That locates it for us, right? It tells us in history, Paul, so we've got a window of time from about 48, roughly 49 when he wrote his first letter, to 64, 65. So that's immediately as long as we assume that the Bible is trustworthy. We don't have to say that all week, I hope. But okay, so that gives us a window of 17 years. To who? Who is it written to? To the saints who are in Ephesus. Is that what the original says? Anyone know? There is a debate there. And so if you look up in a Greek New Testament, you'll see Paul in the opening phrase, to the saints who are space. And so potentially the in Ephesus was added. That's an option. Okay. Others would say, well, the fact that they eventually put in Ephesus, that's what it should be. Let's focus just on Ephesus. I think we can go both and we'll discuss that a little bit. Does it make sense for Paul to write a circular letter? Yes. Does it make sense for Paul to write a circular letter that has Ephesus as a target? Yes, and we'll see why when we get into the book of Acts. Okay, but sometimes some of that textual, critical stuff does matter, and we want to be aware of that. So what else do we have in the book of Ephesians, past the second verse? You know, it's amazing how often preachers skip the opening and the ending to letters, what we call the letter frame. And the opening and the ending to all the letters is very significant. We need to be alert to that. And so within the opening of Ephesians, can we think of any specifics within that opening? Verses 3 to 14, and then the follow-up prayer at the end of the chapter. What are some of the themes, some of the ideas that are within that section? Even the first verse, verse 3. Sorry? In Ephesians, yeah, specifically. So verse 3, for example, blessed be the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ, who has blessed us with every spiritual blessing in the heavenly realms. And he keeps going. Is that targeted to Ephesus, to Asian context, or is that just a general statement? Something to think about, perhaps. What if we discover that in that context, the culture is dominated by a goddess figure, a mother figure, who is the bride, the wife of the city, and she is the provider of all blessings and the provider of life, and if they have a good crop, it's because of Artemis. Suddenly you look at that verse again, you go, blessed be the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ, who has blessed us with every spiritual blessing in the heavenly realms. Suddenly you think, oh, maybe he's being on purpose here. Not just fatherhood of God and the blessing and the spiritual realms context. That's an idea that comes up, the heavenly places. Is the heavenly places a relevant clue to what's going on in Ephesus? We don't know because we haven't looked at Acts yet. But it's something to keep in mind. What do you think, just thinking through Ephesians, what might some of the issues be? So Jewish-Gentile relationships, that's a big theme in the book, so it must be a big issue in the target audience. What else? Yep. Marriage, parents and children, slaves and masters. Spiritual battle, yes. So chapter 6 from 10 to the end. The whole spiritual warfare. Is that just Paul saying, I know, I'll finish this letter with some stuff the boys will like. You know, like this has been, I've had some marriage, the ladies will love that, now let's do some action. This is now an action movie. He's not doing that. He's writing to a specific audience that maybe spiritual warfare, spiritual battle is part of their context. Okay, so as you go through the letter itself, it should be throwing up some possibilities, some issues. But we don't just have Ephesians. What else do we have? Book of Acts. What do we have in the book of Acts that's going to be helpful? Okay, so his journey, which journey does he come to Ephesus? Does anyone remember that? Okay, so the third journey, which starts, even 1823. And so at the end of chapter 18, you've got somebody bringing the gospel to Ephesus, and it's not Paul. It's a Jew named Apollos. But is he bringing the gospel? That's the question. And so he's fervent in spirit, brings and teaches things concerning Jesus accurately, but knew only the baptism of John. So he's speaking boldly. Priscilla and Aquila are there. Okay, so Priscilla and Aquila, we know, have come from Rome. They've been expelled from Rome. We get that earlier in the chapter, don't we? 18:2, because of Claudius. So now we're starting to narrow down history. Expulsion of the Jews from Rome, AD 49. By 54, when Claudius died, they were able to go back. So we have that window, in the early 50s. Here's this Jewish Christian couple. Apollos comes in and they correct him. They help him. And then chapter 19, Paul comes to Ephesus. What happens? Anyone remember he stays there for a while. Right? He's there for a good 2-3 years, right? And what happens while he's there? He starts off chapter 19, verse 8. Entered the synagogue and for 3 months spoke boldly, reasoning and persuading them about the kingdom of God. But when some became stubborn and continued in unbelief, speaking evil of the way, Christians, before the congregation, he withdrew from them and took the disciples to the hall of Tyrannus. So he moves next door to a school, becomes a Bible school. And look at verse 10. This is an amazing verse. This continued for 2 years, so that all the residents of Asia heard the word of the Lord, both Jews and Greeks. That's an amazing statement, isn't it? Let's see if we can see that here. So Asia is this whole region here, and he's staying here for 2 years, preaching, teaching. How could everybody who lives in Asia hear the word of the Lord? Yeah, how? How is it possible if he's in Ephesus? Yeah, the word of mouth, passing it along, people hearing it. Would people travel to Ephesus? Yeah, it's a significant city. It's a very imposing. Yeah. So you've got the Roman infrastructure. You've got trade moving back and forth. You've got Ephesus. Look at its location. Even though it's not quite on the coast, it's still easily accessible as things are coming across by sea past Corinth. Be an easy place for things to enter. So it's going to be a trading place of some sort. You know, we're not talking about an obscure place up here. No offense if you live near there, but this is right on the kind of the coast. It's accessible. A lot of towns are around here. We'll see that on a different map. And so it's a great location. Yeah, people are coming there because it's a center. It's a big population. The archaeologists, historians say, basically if there's a theatre, multiply the theatre by 10 and you've got the population of the city. Now the theatre in Ephesus holds 25,000 people. So you're talking 250,000 people, and in those days that is huge. Huge city, significant city, and if you have a huge city in a region, people tend to go there. And so as Paul stays in one place and preaches, people keep coming. You've got to hear this guy Paul. Next time you're down in Ephesus, go listen to Paul. Where is he? He's in the hall of Tyrannus. Where's that? It's just down from the library. Oh yeah, I know the place. And so everybody knows the place. They're all coming. Word of mouth spreads. And by 19 verse 10, every resident across the whole of Asia Minor has heard the word of the Lord. That's pretty major. Significant ministry, yeah? So then what happens? You get this conflict with this sons of Sheva, however you say that. And then you get the riot. Anyone remember the riot? What's going on with the riot? 2 riots in the book of Acts that are Gentile riots. There's quite a few Jewish riots. Jewish riots are always religious. Gentile riots, it's always the cash, right? And so what's the problem? You've got this temple of Artemis. This is just a reconstruction. Okay, it's very impressive. One of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. And so the Ephesian people are proud of this. This is what makes Ephesus famous. Artemis of the Ephesians. And Paul comes in, and what does Paul do? He preaches about a different God, and people start turning to Paul and going with what Paul's saying. And so the people selling the little statues and the little thing you turn upside down so it has snow. You turn it back and you have the temple of Artemis with the snow. in your own little kind of build your own Artemisian temple kit out of little bits of paper. All of that stuff, which was basically just statues for them, it's not selling anymore. If it's not selling, the whole business, the whole industry, the whole tourist thing, disaster for a tourist industry. It's kind of like the tsunami for Sri Lanka. It's like that's the end of a tourist industry for quite a long time. Devastation. And Paul was like a tsunami coming in and destroying the tourist industry of Ephesus. And so, remember the story? We won't read it in detail here, but Demetrius, wasn't it, creates this big riot. They all gather together. Paul's there. I love this verse 32. It's one of my favorite verses in the Bible. Acts 19:32. Now some cried out one thing, some another, for the assembly was in confusion, and most of them did not know why they had come together. Because gathering of people, and they're all just in there shouting, and one shouting, "Great is Artemis," and another one saying, "Down with the missionaries," or something, and "Great is Artemis, great is Artemis." Why are we shouting this? I don't know. Great is Artemis. And they're just going because it's a riot, and if there's a riot, you join in, right? It's kind of like football. They love this stuff. And so that's all going on, and what happens? I mean, I don't think any of us have an answer to that, except for, you're right, it must have been significant. We've got that reference later. I should have put it in here somewhere. I apologize I didn't. From Pliny the Younger to Tacitus. Anyone read that? It's in about 110, 105 AD, something like that. The governor of this region, and he's writing to the emperor asking for advice. And as he's talking about these people called Christians, they're a bit strange. They meet on the first day of the week. They keep their word. They sing songs to this man Christ as if to a god. So you get this description of early Christian practice. And in it, he makes this comment that people are only now starting to return to the temples, which until now have been deserted. And so Paul's impact from the 50s for the next 50 years, that's just a pure historical document. That's incredible impact. For the governor to say they're only now starting to come back to the temples, which have been until now deserted. That's amazing, isn't it? And so obviously the impact was huge. Now whether everybody became Christian, that may be overstating it. But maybe this is an English phrase, but they burst the bubble. There was this hype around the temple of Artemis, and the gospel just pierced that and it just collapsed. And so obviously it was a big impact to the money people to stir up the riot that we do read about here. It's very significant impact. So what goes on from that? You come into Acts chapter 20, and Paul encourages the disciples, verse 1, and heads off to Macedonia. Okay, so he's left. And he spends 3 months, and he moves on, and then it lists people that are part of this money collection crew. You remember that Paul was collecting money to take from these churches to bring to the church in Jerusalem, but Paul never touched the money. That's the sense you get, is that from each town, each church, they select a couple of representatives to say, okay, you handle the gift from us to make sure it gets there. And Paul says, that's great, because I don't want to have any question about my integrity. All right, so there's Paul kind of saying, okay, hands off. Here's a gang, and they're all carrying their own money bag. And he lists the people here. And what do we find? End of verse 4. Sorry? Yep, so Tychicus and Trophimus, the Asians. This is Asia. These are the two. Okay, then you've got others from other places. And so they carry on. He travels on, Eutychus falls out of the window. Good thing he wasn't in this hotel, because if he fell out of that window, it would have been a disaster. Mind you, he died where he was, so it would have been fine. Comes back to Miletus. We've lost the map, but comes back. Doesn't want to come up to Ephesus. I think because he's in a hurry. He wants to get to Jerusalem. And he knows if he goes to Ephesus, he's so connected, it's going to take too long. So he calls for the elders. The elders come. He speaks to them. By the end of the chapter, he kneels down and prays with them all. There was much weeping. They embraced Paul and kissed him, being sorrowful because the word he'd spoken that they would not see his face again. They accompanied him to the ship, and he heads to Jerusalem. What happens in Jerusalem? Say again? He's arrested. Now, why does Paul get arrested in Jerusalem? When he gets there, he meets with James, head of the church, one of the key leaders, and James says, listen, Paul, rumors abound that you are against Judaism, that you're teaching people that Judaism's bad and terrible and evil, and it's creating a real problem for the Jewish Christians. So just to make sure that people know where you stand, how about you go through a vow, shave your head, do the whole Nazirite thing? And Paul says, yeah, that's fine. I've got no problem with doing that. And so he does that, but then after that he gets arrested. Why? If he's just done a vow and he's come towards the 7 days completed in verse 27, why is it that he then gets arrested? And this is a significant moment for Paul, because he's now going to be in prison for the next 4 years, during which he will write to the Ephesians. Okay, so let's look at the passage. If you've got it open, if not, I'll just read it to you. So 7 days were almost completed. This Acts 21:27. The Jews from Asia, seeing him in the temple. So here's some Jews from Ephesus region. They're seeing him in the temple. They stirred up the whole crowd and laid hands on him, crying out, Men of Israel, help! This is the man who is teaching everyone everywhere against the people and the law and this place, that is the temple. Moreover, he even brought Greeks, that is Gentiles, into the temple and has defiled this holy place. For they had previously seen Trophimus, the Ephesian, with him in the city, and they supposed that Paul had brought him into the temple. That's a little detail that most people have skipped in their Bible reading. So what's that about? Trophimus, a Gentile from the church in Ephesus, is with Paul in Jerusalem, and they don't see Trophimus in the temple area, but they assume that he must have, probably because Paul and Trophimus were tight. These were close. And if Paul was there, Trophimus must have been there. Riot time, get the people together. He has taken a Gentile into the temple. Okay, so let's just nip forward a little bit here. This is the library, by the way. There's the theatre where the riot happened. It was in slightly better condition in those days. And so now he's back in Jerusalem and he gets arrested and he's going to end up coming up to Rome. Okay, so what's going on in the temple? Here's a model of the temple. May not be perfect, but this is a model of the temple. You have obviously the temple, the court of Israel in there where the men can observe what the priests are doing, the court of the women out here. And then notice this line here. It's just a guess where to put it, but this is a wall, a dividing wall within the temple complex. If you're Gentile, you come here or here, you do not go there. You cross that wall, you're in trouble. That's the accusation, is Paul has been seen in the temple, like in there, not in the building, but inside the structure, and Trophimus must have been with him. And if Trophimus has gone with him, Paul is big in trouble. Okay, so why? Because wherever this thing was, it could have been there, it could have been further out, we don't know, but wherever this thing was, the archaeologists have dug up a stone. We'll see the stone in a second. Here's Josephus describing it. Proceeding across this, the open court, towards the second court of the temple, one found it surrounded by a stone balustrade, 3 cubits high, this sort of height, and of exquisite workmanship. In this, at regular intervals, stood slabs, come back, giving warning, some in Greek, others in Latin, of the law of purification, to wit, that no foreigner was permitted to enter the holy place, for so the second enclosure of the temple was called. So that's Josephus describing it. Here's one of the stones that they found, one of the warning signs. Okay, and if you can't read that, maybe that's better. Okay, I'll just let you read that for a second. We could go through it, doesn't matter, but this is the warning translated. No foreigner is to go beyond the balustrade and the plaza of the temple zone. Whoever is caught doing so will have himself to blame for his death, which will follow. It's quite to the point, right? It's like you're welcome to come past, but you're going to be dead and it's going to be your fault. Okay, so that's the warning. The assumption is Paul has gone past that, therefore Trophimus must be with him because they're always together. That's the reason Paul got arrested. And then taken, the Romans take him in, and then he gets transferred out to the coast. And remember the story, most of the rest of Acts, he's waiting 2 years in prison, having trial after trial. They're waiting for a bribe, it never comes. And then he finally gets to a point where things, which way are they going to go? They're trying to get him back to Jerusalem so they can kill him. So he says, no, I appeal to Caesar. Okay, you appeal to Caesar, you go to Caesar. So then he sails to Rome, and then he's in Rome for a couple of years under house arrest. That's 4+ years of Paul's life stuck in a room. And it all started how? In Jerusalem, because of an Ephesian called Trophimus. Even though it's not Trophimus' fault, I'm sure that Trophimus must have felt bad. Don't you think? You imagine coming to like the ELF, and we tried to get plenary speaker Paul, but he's still in prison, so we've had to make do with someone else. You know, that was how Trophimus felt for the next 4 years. Because of my friendship, somehow Paul's in prison. He should be out planting churches. What time does this session end? Is it 1:15? Okay, great. So that's the story. That's the background from the book of Acts. Okay, so what else do we have? We're just looking on the page there. 1 and 2 Timothy. That's Paul writing to Timothy in Ephesus. And so the issues in the church then are the same church. But when was that written? 1 and 2 Timothy. So he's already in Rome, maybe released for the first Timothy, and then back in Rome for 2 Timothy is the way I would see it. And so we're talking 64, 65, 66, somewhere in that region. His visit was back in the early 50s. His letter from Rome to Ephesus was 56, 57. So Timothy is a decade potentially later, almost 10 years later. And so we should read Timothy, and it may be helpful, but it won't be as helpful as Acts and Ephesians. And then there's Revelation 2, letter from Jesus to the church at Ephesus. And what do we have there? 7 verses. When was that written? Yeah, in the end of the century, a generation later. So 90, 95, something like that. Hundreds, probably a bit late, but within that 90s region. And what do we read about Ephesus there? So, commended. Good. But this I have against you. You've left your first love. And so that's a shift. When you look at what Paul said in Miletus to the elders in Acts 20, and you look at the teaching that they were given at that stage, how is it that just 30, 40 years later, Jesus is saying, your hearts are cold towards me? That's a scary thought, isn't it? I suppose we could almost take a warning from that ourselves, that it's possible to do all the right things, to spot false teachers, to become experts in spotting error and heresy so that nobody can get any heresy past us, and yet to grow cold towards God. And that's what Jesus puts his finger on as he writes that letter. So that's the information that we have. Let's just look a little bit more at the context historically for a few minutes. We've seen the temple. Location-wise, we've talked about that. And the fact you've got all these towns around that form a natural loop. Okay, so thinking of those letters to the 7 churches, where are those 7 churches? Ephesus, Smyrna, Pergamum, Thyatira, Sardis, Philadelphia, Laodicea. Isn't that the 7? Almost in order. Certainly Laodicea is the last one in chapter 3. These 3 are chapter 3, aren't they, of Revelation? And then it goes Ephesus, Smyrna. It's Pergamum, then Thyatira at the end of the chapter. I think I'm right. I'm going from memory, but does that sound right? And so there's a circle, a circular route that the postman could deliver Jesus' letters on. Okay, John is on the island. Jesus gives these letters, Revelation 2 and 3, and works his way around the churches. And the church at Ephesus is first there. What do we have in terms of the letter to Ephesus? Back again in Paul's day. He writes from Rome. He writes 4 letters. There's one to Philemon. What are the other 3? Ephesians, Colossians, and Philippians. Okay, so Philippi is separate up there. Where's Philemon written to? Where does he live? He lives in Colossae. If you look at the names, you've got Philemon. Let's see if we can spot it real quick here. So, end of Colossians and then Philemon, we get some of these name references. Philemon is unfortunately placed later. Let's get to that. Epaphras, my fellow prisoner in Christ Jesus, sends you greetings. So did Mark, Aristarchus, Demas, Luke, my fellow workers. Okay. Colossians 4 verse 7. Tychicus will tell you all about my activity. He is a beloved brother and faithful minister and fellow servant in the Lord. Verse 16 of Colossians 4. When this letter has been read, verse 15. Give my greetings to the brothers at Laodicea and to Nympha and the church in her house. When this letter has been read among you, have it also read in the church of the Laodiceans, and see that you read the letter from Laodicea. What letter is that? We don't have an epistle to Laodicea, do we? Colossians here. Paul's writing to Philemon. Tychicus seems to be the carrier, the courier of the letter. He makes a journey to there. He's going to come through here. Could it be that he writes a letter for all of the churches? Here, fill in the blank. You make a copy, fill in the blank, drop off the letter here. The letter can work its way around and make its way to Laodicea. A letter to the Colossians, where he's dealing with a specific local heresy, local issue. By the way, don't miss the letter to the Laodiceans. You want to read that as well. A lot of people think that is Ephesians. It's the letter to the Ephesians and the churches of Asia, ending up in Laodicea. Does that make sense? It is lots of speculation, but why is it at the end of Colossians you get from 4 verse 9 or 4 verse 7 on this whole list of names and all this personal information? In Ephesians you don't get that. When he spent 3 years in Ephesus, he would have had a lot of friends, a lot of people. Greet this person and this person and this person, my kinsman and this person. And we used to meet in their house and say hi to Tyrannus for me. I mean, he should have given all that. Why does he not give any of that? It's unusual for Paul. Chapter 3, verse 1. For this reason, I, Paul. For this reason. Well, he said that before in chapter 1, verse 15. Chapter 1, verse 15, for this reason, because I have heard of your faith, I do not cease to give thanks, remembering you in my prayers. Okay, chapter 3, verse 1, for this reason, is he starting to pray? Not sure, but verse 14, he does it again. For this reason, I bow my knees before the Father, from whom every family in heaven and on earth is named, and this is what I pray for you. Could it be that chapter 3, verse 1, he's about to pray, he's got to the point of writing the prayer to finish the chapter? He doesn't think chapters, but you know what I mean. Having gone through chapters 1 and 2, the role of the Trinity in salvation and the prayer for the power of God and the lives of their heart enlightened, and they were dead too, and they've been raised, and all of that stuff, and God has made the two one and built this temple and preached peace to those who were far off and ththose who were near. And he's brought all of that to a conclusion, and he's like, oh, this is good stuff. For this reason, I bow my knees to the Father, and I'm gonna pray to him for you to grasp all this stuff. But what does he do? Verse 1. For this reason, I, Paul, a prisoner of Christ Jesus, on behalf of you Gentiles. Now, if we're going to put this letter pre his first visit, we've got to find an imprisonment, and we've got to make sense of that reference. And why is it that Paul says, I, a prisoner on behalf, for the sake of you, Gentiles, Why does that cause him to go off on a digression for the next 13 verses? It seems to me that when you put it together with Acts, doesn't it make more sense to say, he was there, he knew them really well, he went to Jerusalem, 2 of them were with him, one of them, Trophimus, accidentally gets Paul in trouble by being recognized, and so Paul is in prison. Why? Because of you Asian Gentiles, specifically Trophimus. And now Paul's writing this letter from prison, and he writes to them and he says, I, Paul, prisoner, and he's quite content with it. He's cool with his whole imprisonment. He's wrestled it through, he's prayed it through, he's okay with God about where he is. Read Philippians for that tone, that sense of his awareness of where he's at, and it's okay. And what does he say here? Prisoner on behalf of you Gentiles, ooh, that might make you feel bad. And so in his sensitivity, you get the next 12, 13 verses. And he goes through and talks about God's grace towards him, this mystery being revealed, this secret plan to make the Gentiles fellow heirs and members of the body of Christ, sharing in the inheritance equally with the Jews, being brought together, and grace was given to me to preach to the Gentiles, so that through the church the manifold wisdom of God might be made known in the spiritual realms. And Paul's just laying this whole thing out that makes you go, whoa, what a digression. And then what does verse 13 say? So I ask you not to lose heart over what I am suffering for you. Why would they lose heart? Because it was one of them. Because of Trophimus. And so he is writing to them after all of the stuff has happened, and he's really concerned because he knows human nature. He knows how much they love him. He knows how their elders cried and wept with him on the beach at Miletus. He knows they must be feeling terrible that he's still in prison. And so he writes all of that. I love that for a digression. Paul's digressions are great. Here's a thought. I think Romans 3 to 8 is a digression as well. That's an interesting thing to chase. But Paul starts something, gets distracted, gives us some of the best theology in the whole of Scripture, and then gets back to what he was saying at the start of chapter 9. He's doing the same thing here for 13 verses. I'm a prisoner on behalf of you Gentiles. Oh, hang on a second, I've got to clarify that. Look at what God's doing. Isn't it amazing? So I ask you, don't lose heart because of what I am suffering for you, which is your glory. I wonder if that became the favorite verse of the Ephesians. Certainly of Trophimus. Don't you think? All that I'm going through, it shows all that you're worth. And I love you. You're worth it because of what God's doing through me. And so if that's the case, that Paul's writing to the Ephesians, and I think he is, he's writing and he knows Ephesus, and he knows the people. But the reason he doesn't give all the personal greetings is because he wants this document to get all the way around the churches that were formed by his ministry in Ephesus. These were people that had come to Ephesus, and churches had been started all over the place. And so he's writing to them, in effect, this is the closest thing to a letter that isn't historically rooted. Because he's not targeting a specific town, he's targeting a region. And what he's giving them is, here's the gospel. Here's Christianity. Let me lay it out for you. And yet it's not in a vacuum. It's two people that he knows and cares about in a situation that is directly connected to his circumstance. And so he leaves out the personal detail, and yet all the way through, the content makes sense for people in a region that is shaped and marked by the town of Ephesus. Okay, so if you look at the page here, just a couple of quick comments. Artemis, there is some discussion under C2 here. There is some discussion over cult prostitution. People will assume that because there was a temple, therefore there was cult prostitution involved. Some scholarship is now saying no evidence. Actually, it was more sort of beauty pageants and parades, and it was the rich and the aristocracy, and there's no evidence that there was great prostitution going on. I don't know if that's true or not, but actually Ephesians doesn't emphasize that issue like Corinthians does, where there certainly was. And so, we want to make sure we don't project Corinth onto Ephesus. Ephesus was fairly sophisticated. It's got some comments there. We've talked about Artemis. 2 religious festivals, big part of who they were, where they come together and celebrate. And then I've laid out the narrative here. Autumn of 52, his first visit. From 53 to spring of 56, his second visit. Spring of 57, he meets with the Ephesian elders at Miletus. Later in 57, once he gets back to Jerusalem, he's arrested. And so, sorry, the letter wasn't 57, that was my mistake earlier. And so then from prison, around 60, 61, he writes to them before he then goes out, and then 1 Timothy would come 5 years later. Okay, so there you have it. There's the background. And all of that is going to be helpful as we look at it to make sense of it. And as we preach it, we can't give that much information, but we can give a sense of what's going on there. And certainly that thing with Trophimus, that's a powerful potential for preaching. If people can feel the weight of Paul's sacrifice on their behalf in Ephesus, can we translate that to the sacrifice of others and of course of Christ for us? Of course we can. So there's going to be that sensitivity that we spot in Paul can come through in our preaching and be relevant to people that we're preaching to.